as jazz became a vehicle for spiritual enlightenment in the mid-1960s and soaked up elements of soul, funk, and psychedelia throughout the 70s. The hands of Lonnie Liston Smith wove a common thread across some of the greatest recordings of the era. Ironically, it's his brief but fruitful time with Miles Davis that's most often lost in the shuffle. From his first session in June of 1972 that produced more than half of the material for On the Corner, through a bi-coastal U.S. tour in the spring of 1973, Smith was a working member of the Miles Band, albeit behind an instrument with which he was largely unfamiliar, the Yamaha YC45D organ. Still, what Lonnie Liston Smith brought to Miles was the same cosmic sensibility that imbues everything he touches. In an interview, Smith says, "When I first met Miles, he was in the recording studio doing On the Corner. I'd never met him, and I walk into the studio and see 3 keyboards, and I said, oh no, and there was Herbie Hancock and another young keyboardist. So I'm standing up against the wall, and Miles walks over and says, 'What the heck you waiting on?' I didn't realize we were all supposed to be playing at the same time. I'd never done anything like that. So now I'm playing the keyboards. Herbie's playing and the other young man is playing, and you've got to really listen because we can't play the same thing." So later I get a call from Miles saying, "Come join the band on the road." I go over to Miles's house to rehearse, and I'm looking for the electric piano. I don't see it, so I ask Miles where it's at, and he says, "Oh no, I'm tired of that." The Japanese had just given him this Yamaha electric organ. I said, "Miles, I've never played that," and he said, "That's great." I ask him if I can take it home to practice, and Miles says, "No, when we get on stage, you'll figure it out." So I have to learn this instrument and create at the same time, and it works. I had to figure out something. I had to be me, and that's what he wanted. Miles was one of the few leaders who'd get mad if you didn't come up with something new and creative every night. Everyone that played with Miles Davis, as soon as you left the group, you automatically formed your own band. Miles was always challenging you, and he wanted you to create. It just made you a better musician, made you much stronger. Lonnie Liston Smith was born in Richmond, Virginia on December 28, 1940, to a musical family. His father was a member of the gospel music group The Harmonizing Four, and he remembers groups such as the Swan Silvertones and the Soul Stirrers as regular visitors to the house when he was a child. He studied piano, tuba, and trumpet in high school and college before receiving a B.S. in music education from Morgan State University in Baltimore in 1961. Smith has cited Charlie Parker, John Coltrane, and Miles Davis as major influences in his youth. While still a teenager, Smith became well known locally as a backing vocalist, as well as pianist in the Baltimore metropolitan area. In 1963, he moved to New York City, where he initially played piano in Betty Carter's band for a year. Early in 1965, Smith began playing with Roland Kirk, first recording with his band on Here Comes the Whistleman in 1965. Late in 1965, Smith joined Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers, sharing the piano position with Keith Jarrett. The Jazz Messengers, together with Miles Davis's group, were one of the main proving grounds for young, up-and-coming jazz musicians. Smith's time as a jazz messenger was fairly short-term, only lasting until a 3-gig engagement at the Village Vanguard. By May 1966, his position was filled by Chick Corea. In May 1967, Smith returned to working with Roland Kirk for the album Now Please Don't You Cry, before continuing his career as pianist for a year with drummer Max Roach. Following this stint, Smith moved to Pharoah Sanders Ensemble in 1968. Fiercely improvisational, Sanders pushed the band creatively to the boundaries of free jazz, recording 3 of Sanders' finest recordings: Karma, Jewels of Thought, and Thembi. It is at this point that Smith began experimenting with electric keyboards. After passing through Miles Davis's ever-changing lineup, Smith formed his own group, Lonnie Liston Smith and the Cosmic Echoes, in 1973. Blending atmospheric fusion, soul, and funk, Smith was encouraged by Bob Thiel, the owner of Flying Dutchman Records. For his debut album, Astral Traveling, Smith re-recorded the title song he had composed and played on with the Pharoah Sanders Band 2 years previous. Although he remained close to his earlier roots with featured versions of Wayne Shorter's Footprints and John Coltrane's Naima on this album, by now Smith was heading into the smooth jazz-funk fusion style that would dominate his output going forward, with dreamy vocals and long, spacey instrumental passages underlaid by strong, funky bass lines, with a message of peace and tranquility in both the lyrics and song titles. I was trying to expand the consciousness of humanity, because when you study all the philosophies and things from around the world, everybody wants the same thing. You might be from a different country or speak different languages, practice a different religion, but everyone wants peace, harmony, and love, explained Smith in an interview in 2009. This attitude may not have endeared Smith to the hardcore free jazz fans who had appreciated his earlier work, but this new relaxed fusion style proved popular with a crossover audience not normally associated with jazz, and the following albums, Expansions, Visions of a New World, and Reflections of a Golden Dream, have since become mainstays of the jazz-funk and chill jazz genres with audiences worldwide. Renaissance continued this crossover fame, and the following year Smith expanded upon his success with 2 new crossover albums, Loveland and Exotic Mysteries, the latter containing the single Space Princess, which became a disco R&B hit. Space Princess was written by and featured the bass lines of 16-year-old Marcus Miller. Another track from the same album, Quiet Moments, was to become a mainstay of the smooth jazz genre over the next decade. After the crossover success of the 1970s, and continuing interest in and discovery of his earlier work by fans of the new Quiet Storm late-night radio smooth jazz format, Smith moved to a new label, Dr. Jazz, and had a minor hit in 1983 with Never Too Late. However, public interest slowly waned in his newer material as the decade wore on, and the cosmic echoes eventually dissipated around 1976. The Dr. Jazz label provided the perfect platform for Smith to showcase his new and critically acclaimed work of the early to mid-1980s. For Dreams of Tomorrow, Smith enlisted the vocal talents of his younger brother Donald Smith. A major musician on the album was Marcus Miller on bass guitar. The Dr. Jazz albums are now considered amongst Smith's finest work. In October 1986, he moved closer to his musical roots with Make Someone Happy, an acoustic session that included new recordings of several jazz standards. However, despite critical acclaim for this work, Smith found himself without a recording contract until the turn of the decade, when the Star Trek label released Love Goddess and Magic Lady. I had a lot of idealistic concepts about music and about the spiritual message I was trying to get across, but most record companies only care about bottom-line sales, said Smith. Around this time, the emerging hip-hop movement took an interest in Smith's earlier work, and he found himself working with rapper Guru, who was mixing hip-hop with jazz in an innovative way. Guru and the other rappers would tell me how their uncles used to make them listen to me and Miles and Donald Byrd, and how they got the message, Smith told Australia's daily newspaper in 1995. He toured Europe in 1991, but after this short period of activity, Smith produced little work in the 1990s. Despite extensive radio play, appearing on a number of compilation albums, and being name-checked and sampled by an increasing number of younger musicians, he spent the next few years mainly involved in setting up his own label. That same year, he recorded Transformation, once again revisiting the genre he had been most successful in, and reuniting with his brother Donald's vocals. For this release, he re-recorded Give Peace a Chance and Expansions, as well as Space Princess. Since 1998, he has continued to perform live and tour on a number of occasions, especially in Europe and Japan, where he remains popular with new generations of listeners. He has also spent much of his time teaching at various workshops. In 2023, he released his first new recording in 25 years, Jazz is Dead. This is Tim from One Track Jazz. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.